In October of 1994, a Peruvian archaeologist named Ruth Shady drove into the Supe Valley of north-central Peru and stood before a series of mounds rising from the desert floor. They did not look like much. The Supe Valley is not a gentle landscape. It is a narrow strip of green river corridor cutting through one of the driest deserts on Earth, the Peruvian coastal desert, where some weather stations have never recorded a single drop of rain. The mounds rose from the sandy desert terrace above the valley, rounded and unremarkable, the kind of feature that travelers and surveyors had been passing for decades without stopping to examine. Ruth Shady stopped. She had been studying the archaeology of Peru for decades. She had learned to read landscapes in a particular way, to see the shape beneath the surface, to recognize the difference between a natural feature and something that had been put there by human hands. And what she saw in the Supe Valley, rising from the desert terrace above the green corridor of the river, did not look natural to her. She began to excavate. What she found over the next 7 years, in the mounds, beneath the surface of the desert, in the carefully layered architecture that emerged as the sand was removed, would require the history of the Americas to be rewritten, not revised, not updated. Rewritten because beneath those unremarkable mounds in the Peruvian desert, Ruth Shady had found a city. A city with pyramids, a city with plazas, residential quarters, temples, amphitheaters, and a system of public administration. A city with a population of approximately 3,000 people, organized into a functioning urban society with a clear hierarchy, a ceremonial calendar, and a sophisticated understanding of architecture and engineering. A city that was 5,000 years old. 5,000 years old, built while the Great Pyramid of Giza was still under construction, built before Stonehenge had taken its final form, built 1,500 years before the Olmec civilization appeared in Mexico. The culture that had previously been considered the oldest complex society in the Americas. The city is called Caral, and the reason you have probably never heard of it is one of the most revealing stories in the recent history of archaeology. The Supe Valley had not gone entirely unnoticed before Ruth Shady arrived. A German archaeologist named Max Uhl had surveyed the region as early as 1905 as part of a broad study of ancient Peruvian sites. He documented the valley. He did not excavate the mounds at Caral. They did not, in his assessment, warrant the attention. In 1948, an American historian named Paul Kosok visited what is now known as the Caral site. He was the scholar credited with first recognizing the Nazca lines, the enormous geoglyphs carved into the desert floor of southern Peru. He was not an ordinary observer. He looked at the Caral mounds, noted their size, referenced them in a 1965 book as Chupa Cigarro Grande after a nearby hacienda, and moved on. The reason both Uhl and Kosok passed over Caral without serious investigation is the same reason it would be overlooked for most of the 20th century. There was no pottery. In the established framework of archaeological site classification, pottery is a reliable marker of social complexity. Complex societies produce pottery because pottery requires kilns, specialized labor, and the kind of settled, organized community that can support non-subsistence production. The conventional assumption was that if a site had no pottery, it was not a complex site. Caral had no pottery. Not a single ceramic shard in the entire 626-hectare complex. That absence told the archaeologists of the early 20th century that Caral was not significant, that it was either very simple or very recent, that the mounds rising from the desert terrace above the Supe Valley were not worth the effort of excavation. That absence was telling the exact opposite of the truth. Caral had no pottery because Caral predated the development of pottery in the Andean region. The people who built it were not primitive people who had not yet discovered ceramics. They were a sophisticated civilization that existed in a period before ceramics were part of the local technological repertoire. A period called the Late Archaic, when the people of coastal Peru were developing something that had never existed in the Americas before. They were developing a city. Ruth Shady recognized what the absence of pottery actually meant. She had spent years studying early Andean sites, and she had developed a suspicion that the conventional framework was missing something important. The mounds at Caral were too large, too carefully shaped, too deliberately positioned on the landscape to be the product of a simple community. The scale of the earthworks implied organization. The organization implied hierarchy. The hierarchy implied a social structure that was, by any reasonable definition, urban. She needed proof. Not suspicion, proof. The kind of proof that the scientific community would accept. The proof came from the Shikras while excavating the largest pyramid at Carol, the Pyramid Maya, which stands nearly 100 feet tall and covers a base area roughly the size of 4 football fields. Shady and her team discovered something inside the retaining walls of the structure. Woven bags. Bags made from reed, packed with large stones, placed inside the pyramid's walls to allow the structure to flex during earthquakes without collapsing. The Shikra was an earthquake engineering solution, a deliberate, sophisticated response to a well-understood geological problem. The people who built Caral were living in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The collision zone between the South American tectonic plate and the Nazca plate, which produces some of the most powerful earthquakes documented anywhere in the world. They had devised a construction technique that made their pyramids resilient to that threat. And the reeds in those woven bags were organic material. Organic material can be radiocarbon dated. In 1999, Shady sent samples to Jonathan Haas at Chicago's Field Museum and Winifred Creamer at Northern Illinois University. The results were published in the journal Science in April 2001. The dates they produced stopped the archaeological world. The Shikras dated to between 2600 and 2000 BC. The earliest occupation of the site went back to approximately 3200 BC. Carol was 5,000 years old. The publication in Science changed everything. And then it produced one of the most bitter disputes in the recent history of Andean archaeology. Ruth Shady had spent 7 years excavating Carol. She had identified it. She had recognized its significance when everyone else had passed it by. She had done the work of establishing its importance before any outside researchers became involved. The discovery was hers. When Haas and Creamer published their dating results, their press releases and subsequent publications gave insufficient credit to Shady's foundational work. The Science Advisory Council of the Chicago Field Museum later rebuked Haas for press releases that inflated the American couple's role and gave too little credit to the Peruvian archaeologist who had actually discovered and excavated the site. The dispute was not merely about academic credit. It was about a pattern that has repeated throughout the history of archaeology. The pattern by which discoveries made by researchers in the developing world are recognized only when validated by institutions in North America or Europe, and in that validation process, the original discoverer is frequently diminished. Ruth Shady had another problem that compounded the credit dispute. She was defending her site from threats more immediate than academic rivals. In 2002, while working at Carol, she survived a shooting as land speculators and agricultural interests attempted to claim sections of the archaeological zone for development. In 2021, tensions escalated when squatters began constructing housing on the perimeter of the site, a UNESCO World Heritage designation, which Carol received in 2009. Provides international recognition but limited physical protection on the ground in a country where archaeological preservation competes with the immediate needs of a living population. The woman who found the oldest city in the Americas spent years defending it with her physical presence. Before we continue, if investigations like this one, following the stories of discoveries that should have changed our understanding of human history, but were overlooked, ignored, or contested, open something for you, consider subscribing. This channel takes these questions seriously. Subscribing allows this research to continue, what Carol actually was, in terms of its social organization, its economy, its relationship to the other settlements of the Norte Chico, has been the subject of intensive study since the 2001 Science publication. The picture that has emerged is extraordinary. Carol was not a village that grew into a city. It was planned. The layout of the site shows evidence of deliberate urban design. The positioning of the 6 pyramids, the sunken circular plazas, the residential quarters, the elite residential complex, the public spaces, all of it arranged with an intentionality that implies advanced planning of the urban form. The 6 pyramids are the most visually striking element of the site. The largest stands nearly 100 feet tall, but the pyramids at Caral are not the same kind of structure as the Egyptian pyramids. They are platform mounds, stepped structures with flat tops where ceremonial activities were conducted, built up in successive stages over generations as new construction was added to existing platforms. The stages are visible in the architecture. Corral was not built once. It was built and rebuilt repeatedly over the course of its occupation, each addition representing a new phase of the city's development. The sunken circular courts are equally significant. These are plazas dug into the desert surface to create enclosed ceremonial spaces, circles of cut earth that served as gathering places for the city's population. Evidence of fire use in these courts suggests regular ceremonial activity. The design of the courts, sunken, enclosed, creating an intimate gathering space separated from the surrounding landscape, implies a sophisticated understanding of how architecture shapes collective experience. What Carral did not have is equally revealing. No weapons have been found at Carral, no fortifications, no evidence of military conflict. In the extensive excavations of the site, across 7 years of systematic work, not a single piece of evidence for organized violence has emerged. The city that stood for over 1,000 years, that organized thousands of workers to build its pyramids and plazas, that developed a system of record-keeping and ceremonial administration, appears to have done all of this without war. This is not simply unusual. It is, in the context of what archaeology has found at most complex ancient sites, almost without parallel. The development of social complexity is typically associated with increasing conflict over resources, territory, and status. Carral challenges that association directly. The economy that supported Carral was built on a relationship between the desert interior and the Pacific coast, that researchers have called the maritime hypothesis, though the reality is more complex than that label implies. The people of Carral did not farm grain. In a period when agricultural civilizations across the Old World were building their complexity on the foundation of cereal crops, wheat in Mesopotamia, rice in China, barley in Egypt, the people of Carral were building their city on the foundation of something else. Anchovies, the coastal waters of the Humboldt Current, which runs along the Peruvian coast, are among the most biologically productive in the world. The cold, nutrient-rich water supports enormous populations of anchovies and other small fish. The people of the coastal settlements near Carral exploited these fisheries on a massive scale, using nets made from cotton to harvest fish in quantities sufficient to support a city-sized population. The cotton came from inland settlements that grew cotton as a primary crop and traded it to the coastal communities in exchange for dried fish. The inland communities that grew cotton were the communities that eventually became Carral and the other Norte Chico cities. The exchange between coast and interior, fish for cotton, cotton for fish, was the economic engine that made urban complexity possible in a desert. The evidence for this exchange is direct. Fish remains, anchovy bones, sardine scales, shells, appear in enormous quantities at inland sites including Carral. Cotton fiber and textile remains appear at coastal sites. The trade network that connected them is documented in the material record, and Carroll's position in that network was not incidental. The city sat at a strategic point in the Supe Valley, controlling access to the river corridor that connected the coast to the interior. It did not grow where it did by accident. It grew where it did because that location gave it a structural advantage in the exchange system that was funding the construction of its pyramids. The most unexpected discovery at Carral is also one of the most significant. Among the artifacts recovered from the site were musical instruments, 32 flutes made from pelican and condor bones, 37 cornets made from llama and deer bones. The flutes are sophisticated instruments, not simple bone whistles, but carefully crafted objects with multiple finger holes, capable of producing a range of notes, music. The oldest city in the Americas was making music. The flutes are not incidental objects. They appear in the archaeological context of the ceremonial spaces, found in deposits associated with the sunken circular courts and the pyramid platforms where collective rituals were conducted. Music was part of the ceremonial life of Carral. The people who gathered in those sunken courts were not gathering in silence. And there was something else, something that connects Carral directly to the civilization that would eventually become the most famous in the Andes, a quipu. The quipu is a recording system, a set of knotted strings of different colors, tied to a primary cord, used to encode information in the patterns of knots and their positions. The Inca Empire, which dominated the Andes from roughly 1400 to 1532 AD, used the quipu as its primary administrative tool. The mechanism by which census data, tribute records, and historical accounts were preserved and transmitted across an empire that stretched 5,000 kilometers along the length of South America. The quipu found at Caral predates the Inca by more than 3,000 years. What information was encoded in the Caral quipu is unknown. The Inca quipus have not been fully decoded. The system remains partially understood after decades of scholarly effort. The Caral quipu, older by millennia, carries whatever its maker thought important enough to record, in a language of knots that no living person can read. Caral declined around 1800 BC, after more than 1,000 years of continuous occupation. 1,000 years during which it built and rebuilt its pyramids, conducted its ceremonies, maintained its trade networks, made its music, and kept its records in knotted strings. The city was abandoned. The reasons are not fully established. Environmental change is the most commonly proposed explanation. The Supe Valley is vulnerable to the climatic disruptions caused by El Niño, the periodic warming of the Pacific Ocean that brings catastrophic flooding to the normally dry Peruvian coast. Evidence of major El Niño events around the time of Caral's decline suggests that environmental disruption may have made the site increasingly untenable. In 2025, new research published in archaeological journals confirmed that the Norte Chico civilization had survived at least one major climate catastrophe, a finding that pushed the timeline of Caral's resilience even further than previously understood. The people of Caral had adapted to seismic activity with the Shikras. They had built their economy in one of the driest environments on Earth. They had lasted for over 1,000 years in conditions that should have prevented complex society from developing at all. And then they left. The people who left Caral did not disappear. Archaeological evidence suggests that as the Norte Chico centers declined, their populations migrated to other parts of the Peruvian coast and interior, taking their knowledge and cultural practices with them. The quipu appears in later Andean cultures. The architectural forms of platform mounds and sunken courts appear in later Andean ceremonial centers. The economic patterns of coastal interior exchange that Caral had pioneered continued and evolved through the cultures that followed. The Inca Empire, which the Spanish conquistadors encountered and destroyed in the 16th century, was the inheritor of a tradition that stretched back 5,000 years to a city in the Supe Valley that no one knew existed. Paul Kosok visited Caral in 1948 and did not recognize what he was looking at. Max Ewell surveyed the valley in 1905 and moved on. For most of the 20th century, the mounds sat in the desert, unremarkable, passed by, left to the wind and the sand. It took Ruth Shady, a Peruvian archaeologist working without adequate funding, without the institutional support of a major North American university in a country where archaeological resources are perpetually scarce, to recognize what was there and to do the work of proving it. The oldest city in the Americas was not found by the institutions that had the resources to find it. It was found by one person who knew how to look. Caral is open to the public now, accessible by road from Lima. Visitors can walk among the pyramids that were standing when the pharaohs were building Giza. They can stand in the sunken courts where 5,000 years ago people gathered to hear music played on pelican bone flutes. Most people who visit Peru go to Machu Picchu. The Inca citadel, built around 1450 AD, is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. Caral is older than Machu Picchu by more than 4,000 years. It is one of the 6 places on Earth where civilization independently originated. It is the foundation of everything that came after in the Americas, and the world largely does not know it exists. That is not an accident of history. It is a choice made by the institutions, the textbooks, and the narrative frameworks that decide which stories about human origins are worth telling. Caral does not fit the story that was already being told. So it was ignored. Ruth Shady made it impossible to ignore any longer. If this investigation opens something for you, share it with one person who needs to see it. And before you go, do you think Caral's 1,000 years of complex civilization without warfare represents a genuinely different model of how human societies can organize? Or was the evidence of conflict simply not preserved? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone.